Wait just a sec. I attempted to blurt before being cut off by the blue beam of energy that had manifested from her arm and blasted me in the chest. I went crashing both through the balcony and the apartment itself, all the way through the other side of the building. I was able to bring myself to a somewhat chaotic halt at about the same altitude. I could hear the woman begin to fly toward me, right through the destroyed section of the building. And while yes, she was heading straight for me, I caught a glimpse of something that drew my attention away despite that fact. In the middle of the living room, where a lot of the furniture had been either knocked around or charred up from the heat of her blasts, sat the nail-charred and torn picture of me and my brother Sean, which had been thrown from the table in all the chaos of my body speeding through the expanse like a rogue missile after the woman's attack. Immediately, I felt my blood boil, and my more cautious approach toward the situation went out the window. The last living memory of my brother that I had left destroyed, all because some nobody had some sort of one-sided petty grudge with me. The woman blasted me with another one of her beams, and this one seemed to be even more powerful than the previous one, because even after putting both my arms up to block the projectile, I was still sent backwards hundreds of feet, my body flipping and flailing until I brought myself to another stop. I was too angry to fully register that a few drops of blood had begun descending from my nose. The woman held both her arms out as she flew toward me, and they both began to light up once again. But this time, I was ready. Before she even fired off her blasts, I ascended high above the projectile's direct path and wasted no time flying right back down toward her at a speed she wasn't prepared to counter. We collided, and I hit her hard enough with my body to send her crashing toward the ground like a human bullet. Her impact threw an empty pickup truck off the ground and dislodged chunks of concrete from the sidewalk she slid across for dozens of feet. It took her several seconds to come to a stop, and she was groaning in pain as she got back onto her feet to take flight again. The fact that she had survived a blow like that meant her body's durability was likely up there with mine. But that wasn't the main thing on my mind. I made a mad dash back over to the apartment complex and flew right through the opening that had been created at the start of our conflict. I stopped and descended before kneeling right over the decimated remains of the picture. The section that had depicted Sean himself was torn beyond repair. I held my breath as I attempted to pick up some of the pieces, pointlessly trying to put them together in a way that would reform the image the way it previously was. But it was no use. A drop of blood fell from my nose and landed on the torn pieces, staining them red as they sat in my hand. I gritted my teeth and squeezed my hands together. I hadn't even heard the woman fly back up, only her heartbeat as she landed several feet away in the path of rubble we created. I looked over, and we both locked eyes. Her previous expression of confidence had faded into one of hesitance. Everything seemed to fall silent around us, and I felt my blood boil. I stood up before throwing my arms back. "Who the hell are you? What do you want from me?" I snarled, my hands now balling into fists after I dropped the torn pieces of the picture. Her expression now seemed to manifest guilt, but she didn't give a verbal response of any kind. Not at first. Instead, she began to walk forward toward me, and I readied myself for yet another attack from her. "What did I ever do to you?" I continued with a tone of disdain. She then suddenly stopped, and only a few feet of distance sat between the two of us. Back on March 12th, the day we first made contact with the Proctons, she began, taking a less threatening tone than previously. "I was a member of the Enhanced Forces, just like you. We were deployed to help the military neutralize some of the ones that had attacked the East Coast. I was sent with a team of 3 others, one of them being Molten. You met him and me in the briefing before the fighting started. He was a fan of yours. He was also my dad. You shook hands with him, told him you liked his suit, and it meant the world to him. But of course, he refused to admit out loud." My eyes widened, and the memory of just what she had described began to reemerge in the forefront of my mind. Her father, Molten, was a newly contracted hero who possessed an immunity to extremely high temperatures, and was able to generate and disperse liquid magma at will. I wasn't sure how he had come into having such abilities. I wasn't at a high enough clearance level to find out. But nonetheless, despite him being about a decade older than myself, I still had several years of seniority over him when it came to the enhanced special forces. From what I was told by my superiors, he had been following my work as rubble, and like the woman said, a fan of mine. Although I didn't see him that way, more or less just a fellow co-worker. "You're Molten's daughter? Sindris?" I asked, softening my tone and taking a less defensive stance. How did I survive the slaughter you left us in the middle of?" she erupted, her eyes beginning to shine brighter than before. They glowed with the brightness of high-powered flashlights. I now knew the source of her anger and almost forgot about my own. After the briefing where I met her father, we had all gone out to fight back against a group of invading Proctons along the coast. At that point in time, pretty much no one was aware of the true capabilities and technological advancement of these beings, and we treated it like any other invasion, even as they were slaughtering regular people by the thousands around different parts of the globe. Some nations weren't able to get the word out to the rest of the world about what was happening, hence why we didn't know the true danger that we were all in. And it would cost us, all of us, something. If it wasn't our life directly, it would be a family member, a friend, or their surrounding community. Once Molten, Sindris, and the rest of the team had already been in the fight for what I remembered as hours, I ended up getting an emergency distress ping from my brother Sean. You see, Sean worked as an EMT, and handling stressful situations wasn't exactly new to him. He and I were both in agreement at the time that pinging me was only to be done if his or a large number of other lives were in danger, and he didn't have access to the proper resources to deal with it. I knew in my gut that he was in serious trouble and that I had to make it back to him before something terrible happened. Despite the fact that leaving in the middle of a fight would get me reprimanded, I didn't care. I left, confident that the rest of the team would be able to hold their own until I returned. But you see, I never told the team why I left. Perhaps from their perspectives, and more specifically, Sindris's, I simply fled without warning. "You left us there. All of us. I watched those ugly fucks blow my dad to hell, all because you were a sniveling coward who ran," she shouted, her previous display of rage re-emerging. Both her arms now began to glow and pulsate in conjunction with her eyes. "You don't understand. I needed to," I began, before she swiftly blasted me with a beam from each arm, ending my sentence long before I could utter another word. I was sent straight out of the building and into the one across the street, smashing right through the mix of glass, rebar, and concrete, as if it were made of styrofoam. It didn't end there. It wasn't until I had come barreling out the other end at a downward angle and was mere feet away from impacting the street that I caught myself, hovering just above it, as if lying flat on an invisible bed. I felt a small but warm stream of blood flow its way down my chin and neck. Putting my fingers to my lips confirmed that was the source of it. It was only a matter of seconds before she was in my line of sight again, hovering some dozens of feet above me. She attempted to blast me yet again, but I evaded by maneuvering to the left before she was able to release her beams. And while she definitely wasn't as fast, she gave chase to me as I took off flying through the streets, weaving between the crumbling buildings. I put some distance between the two of us, but not enough to break her line of sight, which allowed her to keep firing off her beams as she flew after me. A couple came close, but I managed to evade them all. Her cries before she fired each one sort of broadcasted when they were gonna happen. I came to a sudden stop when we got to the end of a particular road that led into an intersection. I dove down before quickly grabbing a red empty pickup truck and throwing it at her as a distraction. Despite the dozen or so yards of distance between us, the truck came barreling at a speed she was barely able to react to, and only had milliseconds to aim and fire a beam from her left arm, one which cut the truck clean in half, leaving jagged scorch marks where the bisection had taken place. I then flew at her with my right arm pulled back and struck her square in the chin with an explosive right hook, one that both drew blood and also sent her crashing into a nearby traffic light pole. Her body bent the metal on impact, causing her to wince and grit her teeth. I barreled toward her while still in flight, and the both of us punctured right through the pole. And as we both slid along the sidewalk below, tearing a path into below, I came down with several more blows to her face, each one forcing the ground to shake and rumble beneath her. But I slipped up, and she caught me off guard with a rapid combination of punches, each one charged up by her energy beams. After about 5 hits, she simply threw her right hand out, spread her fingers, and then blasted me in the ribcage with a beam. I spun like a spiraling football before crashing in through the front doors of an old restaurant. I split 3 different tables in half after I slammed through them, and only came to a stop once I crashed through the wall that separated the dining area from the bathroom, my head colliding with the bottom of the toilet and causing it to crack and nearly crumble. I was already back on my feet when she flew in through the newly formed entrance to the building. Her arms began to glow again as she bared her blood-stained teeth at me with a look of resentment. I stared her down with a mix of frustration and hesitance. The latter was due to the fact she hadn't let me tell her what it is I had tried to say before we had broken out into this pointless scrap. "Stop!" I snarled, using my arm to wipe fresh blood from my nose and mouth. "Just listen to me for a goddamn second." "Listen to you for what? So you can justify how you left us behind?" She blurted in response. "My bruh," I began before cutting myself off. A confused expression emerged on Syndra's face, puzzled as to why I had suddenly stopped my own sentence. In the distance, I heard the roaring of not just one, but several Procton warships. Even through the walls of the building we were in, it sounded close, close enough that we could be spotted, should we find ourselves outside where we were much more visible. There were at least 4 separate ships that I could hear, which would be more than enough to take out both me and her if a physical confrontation occurred. "Don't go back out there," I told her in a hushed tone. "What are you talking about?" she asked while tilting her head. "Warships, Procton warships. They're close. I can hear them." "I don't care," she snarled, just as her arms began to pulsate once more. "I can work around them after I've taken care of you. Look, if they find us with those things, we're both fucking dead. Do you understand?" I snapped. "The both of us put together wouldn't be able to stand up to that." "You couldn't possibly understand what they took from me," she rebutted, somewhat weakly. "They killed my brother," I retorted, catching myself looking at the floor as I said. "They fucking killed him. Took him from me, just like they took your dad from you." Syndra's eyes widened slightly, and although she didn't completely drop her defensive demeanor, her expression told me she was genuinely shocked upon hearing the revelation. "That's why I left the fight. That's why your dad got killed," I began. All in all, I couldn't stop my voice from cracking slightly as I spoke. "Sean, my brother, he was in trouble. I went to try and save him, but by the time I got there, the Proctons already killed him. I got a great opportunity to bury what was left of him. Definitely wasn't much. My dad's been in the ground for a long time now, so yeah, maybe I don't completely understand what happened to you. But don't pretend like you're the only one who lost something. The whole damn world did, for Christ's sake. Go outside and count the decayed corpses of the men, women and children whose graves are the cracked pavement of the streets. They didn't have powers or abilities to fight back with. Imagine how hopeless and scared they felt, how powerless they felt, watching their loved ones die, all while knowing there was nothing they could have done. They thought and believed people like you, like me, like your father were gonna save them, like we always do. And yet we didn't. We failed them. You and me. How many kids do you think were in their bed waiting for their parents to come home that first day the Proctons got here, huh? How many wives and husbands waited for the love of their life to walk through the front door, safe and sound, but they never showed up? How many family members do you think never got the chance to say sorry for all the petty drama and bullshit they put each other through before they were obliterated into nothingness by a goddamn laser? I'm sorry about your dad. I really am. But you're full of shit and need to get off your high horse, thinking that you're somehow the only one who can comprehend what it's like to lose the people you care about. From what I could hear, the warships had begun to approach closer, less than a half mile from where we were. and the window of time to get out of the area without being seen or drawing their attention was closing fast. I'm not gonna keep wasting time fighting you. The real threat is coming. Now, either you can come with me and help make sure that we make those things pay for what they took from both of us and the rest of the world, or you take your chances on your own. I'm sorry again for leaving you behind, but I'm not the one who killed your dad. They did. They're the enemy. Sure, even with the both of us put together, we'll never kill them all. But we can sure as hell hit them where it hurts before we go down. I then lifted myself off the ground and hovered just inches above it. Sindris and I both exchanged a long and silent glance. I didn't expect her to simply drop her grievances with me and let it all go. Several seconds passed, and I could now hear the warships approaching dangerously close to the front of the building. Close enough that I could tell she heard it as well at that point. Without saying another word, I turned and flew out the back window of the building, shattering it without a second thought. I kept low to the ground to avoid being seen, and I couldn't hear Sindris following behind me, which I honestly expected. But I wasn't going to waste any more time being on the receiving end of her vengeful crusade. With my apartment being pretty much destroyed in my fight with her, there wasn't any reason left to stay in Manhattan specifically. Even after all those months of searching, I didn't find the leader of the Proctons there. So I needed to keep looking. There were several small outposts that I passed by on my way out of the city limits, but none of them seemed to have any signs of housing higher-ranking Procton soldiers in them. Hell, there might even be a chance the actual Big Boss himself wasn't even on Earth. And if that was the case, then perhaps killing his second-in-command would get his attention. Just as I had told Sindris, I wanted to hit them where it hurts, for what they did to my home. My people. It wasn't long before I was out of deep Manhattan and had made it into a patch of forest, one that I was sure would only get far larger over time as nature reclaimed all the man-made infrastructure. But that was assuming the Proctons weren't planning to build infrastructure of their own, and the chances of that were slim to none. The trees in the forest stood tall and strong. The surrounding vegetation looked just as healthy. After a few minutes of flying, I eventually came upon a sizable pond and descended, before sitting on a high-hanging tree branch next to it, looking out over the water. I wiped my sleeve across my mouth and nose. The blood that Sindris had drawn from them in our fight had already dried, and my wounds were well into the healing process. Although I'll admit, my ribs did still feel a bit sore from her continuous energy blasts. I took a deep breath and put a hand on my side, groaning slightly from the sharp pain. Speaking of which, I thought about what she said, how she felt. She was angry, and whether or not it was completely rational wasn't the main point. Because I understood it. Humans, even superhumans, were never completely rational creatures. No matter how hard we try to only think and act according to cold logic, it'll never be enough to cut out things like anger, jealousy, greed, and despair. Her rage was the same rage I felt, and still feel toward the Proctons. If I had stayed in that battle, there was no guarantee whether or not her dad would have survived. But there was a chance, and she likely felt as if I had ripped that chance away from her. So to some degree, her anger at me is understandable as well, even if it was misdirected. Guess I should have articulated it better when we were trying to bash each other's skulls in. But the heat of the moment doesn't exactly make you always think everything over as you should. I realized I also hadn't found out why she was in prison. And I probably never would. Kind of strange that she never changed out of that jumpsuit during the last several months, but I'm sure it wasn't the first thing on her mind. Part of me was scared. Not of her or the Proctons themselves, but more of the idea of how truly unforgiving and massive the scale of the universe is. For thousands of years, humanity came about, developed languages, social hierarchies, both created and destroyed civilizations. I mean, yeah, we definitely weren't perfect either. Hell, who knows if the rumors about the reason for the Proctons' invasion were true, and humanity were the ones in need of resources, and had found a close neighboring planet of creatures with technology much less advanced than them. There's no guarantee we wouldn't have done the same thing. But regardless of their many flaws, they were still my people. I was born, grew up, and lived my whole life here. And sure, my experience may have been a bit different from the average Joe's, but these powers aren't my life. I don't feel like they define me. I still had family I loved, friends I cared about. Hell, even after I gained the ability to throw an SUV into space, I still obeyed my regular human mother when she asked me to do something. The sun was beginning to set, and it beamed over the tips of the surrounding trees. I figured that the tree I was sitting in was going to be where I slept for the night. It might seem a bit strange that with all the abilities that I've been given, I still needed to rest. Sure, it took a hell of a lot more to tire me out than the average man, but even I couldn't escape the inevitability of needing to catch some Z's. This isn't something I had really tested the exact limits of, but I once stayed awake for 6 days straight and had not one negative side effect. It was the equivalent of a non-enhanced person being awake for only several hours. Back when the world was still intact, I usually went to bed even before I started feeling tired. Last thing I needed was to start feeling sleepy while flying. And the next thing you know, I accidentally crashed right into a commercial plane, all because I wasn't able to pay attention nearly as well. I wasn't able to accurately count the number of days I had currently been awake for, but it was definitely more than a couple. And that combined with all the bloody battles with some of the Proctons and my fight with Sindris, I felt that it was a good time to take advantage of the quiet. I suddenly awoke that morning to the sound of twigs snapping underneath the branch I was laying on. And soon after that, I heard a somewhat slow, rhythmic thumping, quickly recognizing it as a heartbeat. I peered my head over the side of the branch and couldn't help but crack a smile when I laid eyes on the sight of an adult black bear sniffing around near the bottom of the tree trunk. It raised its snout, taking a few more sniffs before beginning to climb its way up. It wasn't long until the bear's eyes met mine, and we exchanged a long glance. I slowly levitated off of the tree branch and began to float down to the ground as gently as I could, making sure that none of my movements were too sudden or quick. "Hey there, big guy," I greeted with a soft delivery and tone. The bear then backed off of the tree, and all 4 of its paws made contact with the ground below again. It backed up slightly with a defensive stance and a small snarl. But so far so good. Once I was back on the ground myself, I took a small and very slow step forward, allowing the beast to decide its next move. It backed off further, and I kept still where I was. The bear sniffed a few times rapidly and shook its head slightly. I watched as it pointed its muzzle slightly upward, as if looking for something above the both of us. I turned my head up, scanning the tree and finding a plentiful collection of blackberries along several of the larger branches. The bear maintained a defensive stance as it looked between both me and up at the branch where the berries were most plentiful, cautious but determined. "Ah, you're just looking for a meal, huh, big guy?" I asked, once again taking the most inviting tone I could muster. As carefully as I could, I pushed myself off the ground and into the air. The bear backed up yet again, this time much more significantly. Part of me was sure he was going to run, which would have made sense, but instead, he simply watched me while keeping his paws in the dirt, curiously but cautiously. I descended after reaching the berry branch and snapping it off. With it in the grip of my left hand, I landed softly against the ground before proceeding to bend over and lightly place it in front of me. I then took several large steps back. The bear moved forward at a snail's pace, keeping eyes on me as it approached its meal. He seemed a little suspicious, but soon enough, he'd come to realize that I had no intention of causing him harm. And while he was still a wild animal, and I'd never recommend any normal person to do this, it was refreshing to see some form of life that didn't immediately activate my fight-or-flight instinct. So I figured I'd have some fun with it. I continued to put enough distance between me and him that he would be able to eat without feeling disturbed. And once he had closed the distance between himself and all the berries, carefully sniffing around the branch and poking at it with his left front paw, he began to dig in, picking away at the berries like a person chowing down on a kebab. "Enjoy your meal, big guy," I called out softly, to which he seemed much too occupied to acknowledge. "Maybe I'll see you around?" I smiled and turned to begin flying up and above the trees. I shifted my head upward and took off, bursting up through the top of the canopy. But along with the sound of the bear still chowing down on his berry branch, a familiar one emerged. That recognizable rhythmic thumping. I pinpointed the source and swiveled my head around to look right at it. "Seems like that super hearing of yours is a bit selective, no?" Syndra's grilled with dry sarcasm as she floated level with me, her various cuts and bruises still in the process of healing. "What are you doing here?" I shot back while crossing my arms. "And how did you find me?" I thought about what you said, and I hated it. Then I slept on it. Turns out, you were right. And before you say I told you so, no, what I'm about to say doesn't make us friends. Lord knows our psyches are way too deep up shit creek for that to happen anyway. But... She paused, exhaling. "You were right. We're not each other's enemy. They are. And clearly, you want them dead as much as I do, and we can't take that many of them on by ourselves. So I figured it would be in both our best interests to put aside our gripes with each other for now." "You're asking for a team-up, aren't you?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "We're not calling it that," she began. "And I'm sorry about attacking you earlier on. Clearly, we've both got stuff to work on." "You more so than me," I remarked. "Don't push it," she replied with a raised brow. "I'm sorry too. And again, I'm sorry about your dad," I replied after removing the sarcasm in my voice. He was a brave man. For the first time since meeting her, I saw her face take on a neutral expression. Not anger or bitterness. Sure, I didn't expect her to suddenly jump with joy, but it was a start. Then again, I'm not really sure I was all that pleasant either. There's an outpost of theirs set up in a warehouse about 10 miles north of here. Came across it on my way back to Manhattan from the prison. It's heavily guarded, and it'll take the both of us to get into it. Syndra said. "Is that where you think their leader is?" "No, but I know it's where some survivors might be. I saw them taking people in there after the first week of the extermination. None of them came back out." "And you didn't try to help them? Why?" "I had orders to focus on the larger populations and protecting people closer to the coast. It's not an excuse, I know. I should have told someone, but then everything happened with you and my dad soon after, and by the time I was able to get back there, they amped up security heavily, and I knew I wouldn't be able to make it out of there alive by myself, much less while also trying to keep dozens of people out of harm's way at the same time." Silence fell between the two of us, and we both avoided eye contact while figuring out what to say next. Syndra's and I's short-lived rivalry was seemingly put to rest, or at least on hold for the time being. There were people who needed both my help and hers, and despite how things had transpired up to this point, they were what we needed to focus on. "Take me to it. We'll do a flyby and scope the place out, try to come up with some sort of plan, and not just go in there guns blazing and get ourselves killed. Try to keep our distance at first." "Fine, but we shouldn't take too much time. If the people they have in there are even still alive, scoping the place out is gonna waste time. And they notice us too quickly, then they might simply start killing them if they haven't already. Either way, we can't be too slow or too quick. Let's worry about the plan on the way there." Syndra sighed. "They're running out of time."